Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all having a wonderful day so far. In today's video, we're going to be discussing an incredibly infamous couple from the UK, Fred and Rose West. You may have heard of them, you might not have, but if you have heard of them, you will know it's going to be a really difficult case to get through. Researching into this couple was extremely difficult from an emotional standpoint. I had heard a lot about them, but I'd never actually properly looked into what they had done, and it's safe to say that it is truly horrific. Because there's just so much information available on this case, and this is such a great thing to find compared to other cases which I've recently covered, we're going to do things a little bit differently. And by this, I mean we're going to split the content up into two different parts. This is just to make it so it's much more manageable for you guys, because otherwise it would mean that the video would be over an hour long. So today you're watching part 1 of the case, and in a few days, part 2 will be released. I didn't expect this case to be anywhere near as long as it was when I first started doing the research, so I do apologise with the delay with uploading. The research took a lot longer than I expected it would do, but I promise we will be back to the regular bi-weekly schedule very soon. So I'm going to stop rambling now and we will get into the video. But first, I just want to give my usual disclaimers. This video contains topics which may be distressing to some viewers. These topics include child abuse, SA of adults and minors, torture, internal family relations, and of course murder. There may be further topics included which I have missed here, so viewer discretion is definitely advised for this case. We're going to be covering a lot of heavy topics today, so if that's something you don't think will be suitable for you, please feel free to click off the video and hopefully I can see you again when we're discussing a topic which might be more suitable for you. I would also like to quickly mention that all of the information we're going to be talking about today has come from research which I have conducted through sources which are readily available on the internet. No disrespect is intended with this presentation in any way, it's all for educational purposes only. I tried to get all of the information correct to the best of my ability, but I do apologise if there are any mistakes at all. I do try and avoid this as much as possible. So, without further ado, let's get into today's case. Today we're going to be talking about Fred and Rose West. If you've heard of them, you may know where this is going. So I'm going to start off today's case by talking about the life of Rose West. Rose West was originally born as Rosemary Pauline Letts to parents William Andrew Letts, who was also known as Bill, and Daisy Gwendolyn Fuller. Daisy had a very difficult pregnancy, and on the 29th of November 1953, Rose was born in Northam, Devon in the UK. Rose was the 5th child out of a total of 7 children, and her father was an electrician and her mother a homemaker or housewife. Sadly, Rose's mother Daisy was subjected to electroconvulsive therapy throughout the whole pregnancy with Rose, and this is because she had a really deep depression. Because of the electroconvulsive therapy, it was reported it may have caused prenatal injuries to Rose, and this may have led to a lower educational performance. If you don't know what electroconvulsive therapy is, it's basically where you get electrocuted. It's really barbaric. I'm pretty sure they don't do it anymore, but it was very, very common back in like the 50s and things as like a cure for I think things like schizophrenia and depression, like it was used here. It's just really, really barbaric, but they did it whilst Daisy was actually pregnant with Rose, which is crazy that they were willing to even do that. So Rose's siblings also reported that as a baby, Rose would rhythmically bash her head against her cot during the night, and as she grew older, she would often stand in a trance-like state for a long period of time. And it's believed that this may be due to the effects of the electroconvulsive therapy that she experienced while she was still in the womb. So yeah, I still don't know why they would even consider doing that. It was said that family life that Rose experienced while growing up was really dysfunctional. Her parents' marriage suffered due to her father's terrifying, violent, paranoid, schizophrenic outbursts, and this resulted in the marriage being a really violent and unhappy one. It was even said that the children weren't allowed out of the bounds of the family home and were prohibited to get their clothes dirty. This resulted in them walking around the garden stiffly in order to get out of the house but make sure that they stayed clean. Her father Bill was said to be a lot more lenient with Rose over his other children, as he believed that she had something wrong with her. But it's also speculated that this is because he sadly liked to S-hate her as well, which is really sad to hear. Rose was known as Dozy Rosie at school and was often bullied by her peers due to being chubby and performing badly in her schoolwork. She was said to have grown into a very moody teenager who by the age of 13 was really oddly interested in sexuality. This resulted in her intentionally walking around naked in front of her younger brothers and sadly resulted in her sneaking into their beds to SA them during the night. It's really troubling from such a young age that she was showing such, bad behaviour, and I don't even want to say bad, it was just concerning behaviour right from the start. I saw the reports that the marriage of Rose's parents eventually did break down, and this led to Rose's mum Daisy taking Rose out of the family home. But Rose did eventually move back in to live with her father around the same time she met Fred in 1969, and during this she was aged only 15. At this age, she also dropped out of school and had decided to work in a local bakery instead. So she dropped out of school at 15 to work in a bakery. So now I'm going to talk about the childhood and upbringing of Fred West. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born in Muchmarkel, Hertfordshire in the UK on the 28th of September 1941 to parents Walter Stephen West and Daisy Hannah Hill. I just realised, are both parents called Daisy? Yeah, they are. Okay, that literally just clicked to me then. He was the first surviving child in the family of poor farm workers. This is said to have caused his mother to be extremely overprotective of him, whereas his father was a really strict disciplinarian. His parents eventually went on to have a total of 8 children, but only 6 of these children survived, with Fred being his mother's obvious favourite. During school, he was reported to be scruffy, quite naughty, and often getting into trouble, remaining barely literate throughout his whole life. He and his siblings were assigned a lot of farm chores as they grew up, and this was to ensure the family farm would run smoothly. And these chores were said to instill a really strong work ethic for Fred throughout his whole life. He later claimed that he had been subjected to SA by his mother when he was 12 years old, and had also engaged in bestiality as a teenager, as well as stating that his father was in an incestuous relationship with his sisters. Fred's younger brother has dismissed these claims, so we can't actually say whether they're true or not. So, like always, please take that with a grain of salt. It cannot be proved, it cannot be disproved. It's a lot to take in already. Within both of these people's lives already from a young age, they're going through a lot of stuff. So by the age of 16, Fred was beginning to develop troubling ideologies. He only saw women as objects of pleasure and often aggressively pestered them, as well as approached them and groping them without consent. It's reported by women who dated Fred that he only ever cared about his own gratification and never tried to please them at all. At the age of 17, a motorcycle accident left Fred in the hospital unconscious for 7 days. From this accident, he had a broken leg and a fractured skull, and this caused him to develop an extreme fear of hospitals and would send him into fits of rage whenever he had to do anything medical related. 2 years later, age 19, Fred was pushed down a fire escape 2 floors high when he essayed a girl in a youth club. The young girl punched him, which made him fall from 2 stories high and caused him to sustain another head injury. Horrifically, in 1961, when Fred was 20 years old, his younger sister Kitty, who was 13 years old at the time, reported to her mother that Fred had been SAing her since the December, and sadly she had actually fallen pregnant from the assaults. Luckily, Fred was reported to police for this, but when he was arrested, he admitted to the officers that he had been SAing young girls since his early teenage years, and he actually thought it was something that was normal to do. Very, very troubling. Fred was going to actually be tried for this on the 9th of November 1961, and his mother said she was willing to testify in his defense. So his mum was going to stand up for him against her own daughter. And that absolutely disgusted me to read. This poor girl has been SA'd by her own brother, fallen pregnant, and you are still willing to back the son up in this. It's absolutely horrific. It knocks me sick. Sadly, Kitty did change her mind shortly before she was due to testify, and the case collapsed. And that meant he wasn't charged for the crimes. He got away with it. But his family did kick him out from the family home, and this meant he had to move in with his aunt. He did later reconcile with his parents, but the rest of the family still really disliked him. I mean, are you surprised? I'm not. I'm surprised his family did reconcile with him, but, you know, they were willing to kind of back him up in it anyway. It's just disgusting the whole way through. Fred's first marriage was on the 17th of November 1962 to 18-year-old Catherine Costello from Scotland. Catherine often went by the nickname Rena, so I'm going to refer to her as Rena from now on. Fred was 21 when they got married, and at the time of their marriage, Rena was actually pregnant with another man. They initially lived together in Fred's aunt's home, where he had a job as an ice cream van driver, and they had a baby girl called Charmaine. And this is the baby that Rena was pregnant with before they actually got married from a different man. So this child isn't biologically Fred's child. Someone else is her father, but Fred did take her in when he married Rena, and they called her Charmaine. When Charmaine West was born, They did sadly claim that she was fully adopted as an excuse to explain why the little girl was mixed race. And this was because they didn't want people to know that she was fathered by another man and not Fred. And that really upset me to hear. Fred and Rena had a second daughter together in 1964, who they named Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie was Fred's biological child. It was said that Fred was an extremely harsh and cruel father who kept his daughters caged in bunk beds, where they were only allowed out of the beds when he was away at work, which is wild. So from what I could find out was that they had bunk beds, but like where you could get out of the, like the bottom bunk, there's like the gap to get out. That was basically caged shut, and they were only allowed out when Fred wasn't there. Fred later admitted to having numerous affairs whilst in their marriage with Rena, and even fathered a child with another woman behind her back. When Rena found out about Fred's affairs, she actually started her own affair, and this only filled Fred with rage. Of course it did. And sadly, this resulted in him punching her and attempting to stab her affair partner. But luckily, he only grazed the affair partner's abdomen instead. This fueled a long-standing feud between the two men, who would often engage in fights over Rena. It's also said that Fred would often beat Rena too. Rena eventually escaped from Fred with her affair partner and took her 2 daughters. There's a lot more information into this relationship. If you do want to actually look into it, I would suggest looking into it further if you wanted to find out more, but I am going to leave it here to avoid making the video even longer than it already is. But we do know that from police records, the 2 daughters were in and out of foster care constantly throughout their lives, but were sadly eventually returned to Fred later on, which it's just awful that they went to Fred and not their mother. One of Fred's affair partners was called Anne McFall, and she was only 16 years old at the time of their meeting. She had, according to sources, become completely infatuated with Fred, especially due to his promises to marry her, which of course she believed, and this was probably due to how young and vulnerable she was at the time. She was only 16, and this grown man was just taking advantage of her. I also saw references stating that in 1965, Fred accidentally hit a young boy whilst out driving his ice cream truck in Glasgow, and the collision did kill the boy. He killed a young boy in 1965 by hitting him with his truck. Fred was cleared of the wrongdoing by police, as it was said to be an accident, but because of this, he did flee back to Gloucester, fearing for his livelihood after the accident. I don't know why he fled. I guess he was kind of worried that people wouldn't like him anymore after he killed a kid with his truck, but I don't know. Apparently he was still in a relationship with Rena during this time when the incident occurred. Apparently this, I find it hard to stick this in, like fit this in somewhere, but this happened during the relationship, and then she left after this. Sadly, Anne McFall, who was now aged 18 in July of 1967, sadly she vanished without a trace, but was never reported as missing. She was said to be 8 months pregnant with Fred's baby at this time, and during his later arrest, Fred claimed that he did not kill her, but knew where police could find her body. She was found buried at the edge of a cornfield between Muchmarkel and Kempley. She had been completely dismembered, and finger bones were missing from her body, which is believed to be because Fred had taken them as a kind of trophy. She had also been restrained prior to her death, as dressing gown cord was found wrapped around her wrists. To make things even worse, police were unable to locate the unborn fetus within her remains, leading them to believe the baby had also been cut from her body. Fred did eventually admit to killing Anne to an inmate whilst he was in prison. All of these horrifying acts had occurred before Fred and Rose had even met each other. But things were not going to get any better once the pair did cross paths. Fred West and Rosemary Letts were said to meet in early 1969 at the Cheltenham bus station when Rose was only 15 years old and Fred was 28 years old. It's so disgusting, so predatory. Why? It's just, he just disgusts me. He just disgusts me in every way, and it gets worse. You will see by the end of this, it gets even worse, and I cannot prepare you enough for how much worse this case just gets. It gets to the point where you're like, surely it can't get worse than this, and it does. It just manages to get worse every single time. Rose was said to be completely disgusted with Fred's dirty and unkempt appearance at first, but she quickly started to fall for him when he gave her a lot of attention when he would see her at the bus station over the coming days. He made sure he sat next to her and accompanied her home. So he's essentially grooming her, isn't he? She's a literal child, and this man, this He's almost 30. This fully grown adult is just grooming her, and it's just disgusting. She did originally refuse to go on dates with Fred when he asked her out. Keep in mind she is a child and he is a grown man. But she eventually confided in Fred that she had never had a boyfriend yet, and Fred tried to gain sympathy from Rose by telling her that his wife had abandoned him and his daughters, and essentially manipulated young Rose into feeling sorry for him. Again, grooming, trying to pull the heartstrings. Sadly, Rose eventually accepted an offer to go on a date with him after he persuaded another young woman to go into the bakery where Rose worked and give her a gift from Fred. I guess Rose was flattered by this because when Fred came into the bakery shortly after, she accepted his offer of a date, and this ended up leading into a full-blown relationship between a 15-year-old child and a 28-year-old grown man. Just remember the age gap here. Just remember the age gap. Disgusting. Things moved really quickly with the two of them. Rose quit her job only a few weeks after they met in order to be a full-time nanny for Fred's two daughters, and Fred would give her money to give to her parents so they wouldn't suspect that she had quit her bakery job. So she's spending a lot of time with Fred already, and they have just met. One good thing I found about Rose's father, this is literally the only slightly okay thing about this man, is that when he was introduced to Fred, he actually became really angry and stated he would call social services on the man if he continued to date his 15-year-old daughter. Rose's mother was also said to be disapproving of the relationship and concluded that Fred was a pathological liar, which we all know is true. He is a pathological liar, as we'll see. Rose was eventually placed into a home for troubled teens in the August of 1969, after her parents reported the relationship to social services when the two refused to stop seeing each other, and Rose's parents had actually heard rumours that she had begun to provide paid sexual services to other people at 15 years old. She was only allowed to return home at weekends, but instead of using the time to visit her parents, she visited Fred behind her parents' back. So it's just, I feel like there was so much opportunity to stop this, and it just wasn't. It could have been stopped here, but it kept going, and it's so frustrating. Rose was allowed to leave the home for troubled teens when she turned 16, so it didn't take long for her to leave there. And at the time, Fred was actually serving a short prison sentence for theft and unpaid fines. But as soon as Fred was released from prison, the two moved in together in a flat owned by Fred in Cheltenham. Her parents did attempt to get Rose to come home, which resulted in her being placed into care for less than a month, and this was because it was found that 16-year-old Rose, she is now 16, 16-year-old Rose was pregnant with Fred's baby. Can't help but feel like social services actually really let Rose down. She was just released so quickly from care, and of course she's going to run straight back to Fred. And, she's a child. She doesn't understand that she's literally being groomed at this point. And I feel like I mentioned before, it could have been stopped here. We could have never got to where it was. The relationship could have been stopped here if people just used the proper precautions and actually stepped in more than they did. Like, they put her into care for what, a month? A month. What is that going to do? And I didn't see any things of like saying how they, tried to talk her out of it or say how bad it was or anything like that. But it's crazy. It was a different world back then. It really was. And I don't think things were taken as heavily as they should have been. They were taken too lightly. And because she went straight back to Fred, this resulted in her father forbidding Rose from stepping foot in the family home again. So I found that really, really upsetting. Her family have just given up on her. They've just given up on her. She's 16 years old. She's pregnant with a grown man's, almost 30-year-old man's baby. And they have told her, we don't want you to come home. Just leave. It's sad. Her family just gave up. Rose eventually did give birth to a daughter on the 17th of October 1970, who they named Heather Ann West. But Rose was soon left looking after all three children at just 17 years old, as Fred was arrested yet again. And this was only 2 months after the birth of their daughter, and he was arrested for the theft of car tyres and a vehicle tax disc. So if you don't know what one of those is, the tax disc is something, it was a piece of paper that you used to have to put in your car. I don't remember when they got rid of it. It's all digital now. It's all online. But you used to put it in your car, and it just proved that your car had been taxed. and it was like roadworthy, basically. So he was stealing them from cars, I guess, to put in other cars, so he didn't have to pay tax on his car. That's my guess. And the other children were, of course, the two other daughters of Fred's from previous relationships, little Charmaine and Anne-Marie, and of course the new baby Heather that was Rosa's baby. There have been reports that Charmaine and Anne-Marie, who were approximately 7 and 6 years old at the time in 1960, experienced extensive physical and emotional abuse at the hands of 17-year-old Rose whilst in her sole care while Fred was in prison. It's really sad to hear that little Charmaine, who was Fred's stepdaughter, the adopted stepdaughter, had actually talked to her sister Anne-Marie about how she hoped her mum would come for her, stating, quote, "Mummy will come and save me." Poor Charmaine was said to anger Rose greatly because she didn't react to the abuse with cries. The little girl was said to remain stoic throughout all of the abuse. A neighbourhood friend of the young girls had also reported accidentally walking in on the abuse of Charmaine at one point, seeing Charmaine completely unclothed, bound at the wrists with a belt, and Rose stood nearby holding a large wooden spoon. And I'm guessing that the spoon was actually used to beat poor Charmaine. There are also hospital reports for Charmaine receiving treatment at some point for wounds, but nothing was done to help the girl after her hospital visit. There was no reports. Nothing was ever done. She was just left to go back home to the abuse that she was experiencing. It's really sad. It's so frustrating with this case because there is so many points where things could have just been stopped. If the right people took the right actions, things just didn't have to go on how they did. And it's so upsetting that they had to go to this extent. There was just no need for it. And it makes you wonder, like, why does nobody report these things? It seems to happen way too many times that people just don't report things like this, and it just keeps getting worse and worse as people realize that they're not going to get caught for it, or they believe they're not going to get caught for it. Just why? It's so sad. Sadly, poor Charmaine lost her life at the hands of Rose in 1971, and during this she was just 8 years old. An exact date or cause of death is unknown, but it's believed to have occurred sometime between the 15th to the 24th of June 1971. As Rose had taken all of the children to see Fred in prison on the 15th, before he was released on the 24th. Her body was stored in the cellar of the house until Fred got out of prison, where he then dismembered her and buried her naked body in the garden of the house under the kitchen window. The sudden disappearance of Charmaine didn't go unnoticed, with a neighbourhood friend coming to see where she had gone, only to be told she had gone to live with her mother in Scotland and wouldn't be back. This lie was also told to Anne-Marie, the youngest sister of Charmaine, who was upset that her mother hadn't come to collect her too. Charmaine's school also raised concerns at her disappearance, but again, they were told she had gone to live with her mum, and no further questions were asked into the situation. No one looked in. They just took the first excuse as the truth, and no one looked any further, and she remained missing without anyone knowing for just way too long. Sadly, Rena, the mother of Charmaine and Anne-Marie, also fell victim to Fred and Rose West after she began to inquire about her daughter Charmaine's whereabouts in August of 1971, shortly after the death of Charmaine. Family members remember Rena being extremely depressed and anxious about how her daughters were being treated within the West's household, and this led her to go to the address in order to talk to them, and it's believed that this talk was supposed to be about her possibly getting custody of the two girls. At this meeting, it's believed that Rena was strangled to death by Fred in his Ford Poplar car. Her body was later found completely dismembered in Gloucestershire, around a mile from where Fred grew up. So, both Charmaine and her mum, Rena, have now lost their lives. And McFall as well. So, there's 3 known victims at this point already. By 1971, we have Anne McFall, Charmaine West, and Rena West as well. All 3 of these people have already lost their lives. It didn't take long for Fred and Rose to move on from what happened to Charmaine, with them getting married on the 19th of January 1972, just months after the death of Charmaine and Rena. At this time, Rose was also pregnant with their second child. When they got married, Fred incorrectly marked himself as never being married before, which I believe at the time he was actually still legally married to Rena. Even though she had been killed by Fred, of course, this wasn't known by authorities, so to them, she was still considered alive. Therefore, it was actually illegal, as you can only have one monogamous marriage in the UK by law. It's only allowed to have one marriage, and any further marriages mean that you've actually committed the crime of bigamy. So, but this was never picked up again. I don't know why this wasn't picked up, but it was never picked up until much later on. After their marriage, Fred and Rose moved to 25 Cromwell Street, which is now known as the incredibly infamous address, often being referred to as the House of Horrors. This house was purchased from the government for £7,000, and the upper floors of the three-storey home were made into bedsits, or small, bed-only apartments basically, with shared facilities, and this was done to give the couple extra income. On the 1st of June 1972, Rose gave birth to a second daughter who they named May June West, due to when she was born. She was born on the 1st of June, so they named her May June. Shortly after the birth of May June, Rose began to offer sexual services in exchange for money. Operating from an upstairs room in the house, Rose was said to completely control all of the family finances. She also began to engage in sexual acts with both male and female lodgers in the house, as well as people from Fred's work. Rose was said to be into sadism, inflicting physical pain on her sexual partners in order to provide herself with sexual satisfaction. It's also said that Fred sometimes joined in with these acts, where they both enjoyed filling their victims with fear as a way of showing dominance. They collected a large range of fetish gear and devices, but also expanded this into creating collections of acts involving animals and children, which is absolutely just disgusting. I can't even describe. I hate it. It makes me so mad. I told you that things just keep getting worse with this case. Do you think you've heard the worst of it, and then things just get dragged down even worse? It's just non-stop. Another thing which was truly disgusting was to find out that Rose's father had also begun coming over to the house to engage in services with Rose. He was hiring his own daughter for sexual services. He had finally begun to accept the relationship with Fred, which meant for some reason that he was okay with hiring his own daughter for sexual services, which, what? I don't know. It's awful. It's just awful. I the amount of times that I just got so mad during this, so mad. Within 11 years of their marriage, Rose had given birth to a total of 8 children, all of who were fathered by different men, and all of these men were her clients. Fred was said to be completely okay with this, and even accepted all of the children as his own. The abuse of the children began to get even worse over time, with each child being assigned a series of chores, as well as being forbidden from leaving the perimeters of the home, which, if you do think back to Rose's childhood, it sounds very familiar to what she endured. If these chores and restrictions were disobeyed, strict punishments were given to the children, which they are said to have really been scared of occurring to them. The majority of these punishments were handed out by Rose, of course, who was very strategic in the way that she harmed the children. She always made sure that she would never actually hurt the visible parts of the children's bodies, so that no one would notice their injuries or bruises, and then, of course, nothing would be reported. And these injuries were said to include kicking and punching the children in the chest, as well as using knives to slash their skin. And this was not deep enough to cause really deep wounds, but it was enough to, of course, cause a lot of pain and bleeding. So it's just really sadistic, like the lengths that she'd go to. Like she was very well aware of what she was doing, that it was wrong, and she tried everything she could so that people didn't find out the sick and twisted things that she was putting these kids through. There's just so much thought behind it, and it's truly awful. This abuse eventually led Heather Ann West and Stephen West, who was a younger son to the family, to run away. They slept on the streets and stayed with friends when they could to avoid having to face the horrors at home. Sadly, the children did have to return home after a few weeks and were, of course, horrifically beaten when they did return. Within the childhood years of the family, the children were taken to the A&E department of the local hospital for a total of 31 times, all of which were reported as accidents. This huge number of hospital admissions was never flagged to social services though, so of course nothing was ever done about it. It's also said that Fred was sometimes a victim of Rose's violence as well, with on one occasion Rose attempting to stab Fred in 1974, and instead of stabbing him, she stabbed the door as he slammed it in her face, and this caused her to deeply cut 2 of her own fingers in the process, and it's reported that she barely reacted to this. from what I could find from like the sources, it was a pretty bad wound as well, and she apparently just barely reacted to it, which is really, really weird. Sadly, the physical abuse of the children had also turned into SA by September of 1972. This SA is said to have been particularly aimed towards 8-year-old Anne-Marie. I don't want to go into too much detail about the assault because it is really hard to speak about, and you know, it's really upsetting to think about as well. I don't think we need to go into detail about this. But poor Anne-Marie was restrained and SA'd by her own father, Fred West, with her stepmother, Rose, encouraging the act the whole time. When the crime was completed, Rose was said to tell Anne-Marie that every father did this to their daughter, and that it was a father's job to do such a thing, and that this must be kept a secret from everyone. She was also threatened with severe beatings if they found out that she had ever told anyone, so she kept it to herself. The awful act progressed to even worse depravities when Anne-Marie, aged 13, was forced to provide sexual services to the clients within the brothel run by Rose. Rose lied to the clients, stating that Anne-Marie was 16, which is still disgusting because 16 is still a literal child. Why were these people willing to do that, even when they believed that she was 16, even though she was 13? It's disgusting. It's really, really disgusting. I know I keep saying it's disgusting, but I physically can't think of any other words. My brain just goes blank, you know? I don't know whether anyone else is the same, but my brain just goes blank. I just get really mad, and it's just so upsetting as well. It's so upsetting. Further reports state that Fred had expressed the intent and desire to impregnate each of his daughters at least once, and would force his children to watch adult content with him. It got to the point that the two older daughters, Heather and May, would make sure they always hung around with their slightly younger brother, Stephen. They knew that if they stuck together as a trio, the father wouldn't SA them, as he only did it when one of the girls was alone. And this included when it came to changing and showering. They would only do so if Fred was out of the house, or if a sibling stood guard of the door to the room. Even the school noticed that Heather became very distressed when having to change or shower after sport classes, and noticed that she had cuts and bruises all over her body when she did actually do so. She told the teachers that these injuries were due to fights with her siblings, and because of this, once again, it seems that nothing was done about it. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch part 1 of the Fred and Rose West case. Part 2 will be coming very shortly, so please keep an eye out for that. To make sure you're notified when the next part is uploaded, please subscribe to my channel and turn on video notifications by clicking the notification bell down below. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could give this video a like and let me know what you thought in the comments below. As always, this video was recorded live over on Twitch, where I stream several times a week. So, if you'd like to see more of me, be sure to check out my channel, which you can see on screen right now, or in the description box down below. I just want to say a big thank you once again for your support with this content. I really hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Remember to be kind to yourself and others, and hopefully I will see you all very soon. Goodbye!